Okay, today my guest is Professor George Yip. I will keep my introduction short to maximize our time with him. In the next 30 minutes or so, we'll talk about George as a person and Professor Yip as a thought leader and a esteemed scholar. And then in the final segment, as a mentor to many PhD students and junior faculty. George is a fellow of the AIB. He's a senior fellow of the UK's Advanced Institute of Management Research. He's the organizer of AIB's AIB Gurus Executive Seminars. He was and is the Dean and Associate Dean, has held positions at Imperial College and Erasmus. He was the Associate Editor and has editorial board memberships at JIBS, Asia Pacific Journal of Management, Business Strategy Review, Journal of International Management, Journal of International Marketing, and Long Range Planning. Thank you, George, for joining. So the first question, what did you want to become when you were a child?
My first memory was that I wanted to be an artist and then an author. But then from about the age of 12 until 18, I thought I'd become a scientist, but eventually lost interest in that and switched from natural sciences to social sciences, which I interpreted as economics, which is what I studied at Cambridge University.
And can you pinpoint the earliest moment of domestic versus foreign distinction?
That's quite funny. My first childhood memories occurred when I was already in a foreign country, when I was about age 3, when my father was a country manager posted from Hong Kong to Burma, although at the time, of course, I did not conceptualize the fact that he was a country manager. So not many IB scholars have a father who was a country manager.
What pushed you to be an IB scholar?
That was really an accident. With an international background, I'd always resisted being pigeonholed for international, and my doctorate was in business strategy under Michael Porter. And I became interested in international business only when he opened up the theme of global strategy, which in many ways goes counter to traditional international business because it focuses on commonalities rather than differences between countries. So for example, Helmut Schutter of INSEAD, a traditional IB scholar, said to me in the mid-1990s, George, I've figured out the difference between us. We tell multinational companies how to adapt to countries, and you tell countries how to adapt to multinational companies. So that was a little joke, but it did show the difference and how I was viewing IB from a completely different angle.
Yes, interesting. And what are some of the things that not many people know about you, the things that wouldn't appear on a CV?
Yes, well, two of my favorite activities are playing tennis and singing classical music. Those are not on my CV.
Oh, yeah. So you still continue singing?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. But if you stop doing what you're doing today, what would be your second best alternative or different career path?
Well, I'm already emeritus and retired, so it's too late for that. But at the age of 21, I nearly became a barrister. And also I've worked 3 times in management consulting, both before and after being an academic. So that's the most likely alternative path. And lastly, I've often thought I might have liked being a mutual fund manager because I like doing numerical analysis.
See, let's talk about regrets. And what is one thing that you wish you would have done that you didn't at the time?
I wish I'd spent more time learning maths in university. That would have been very useful in my later research.
And what are you most passionate about?
What am I most what?
Passionate. What's your passion?
You mean work-wise or non-work-wise?
Non-work-wise.
Non-work-wise. Well, actually, I have many interests, including theatre and opera. And in fact, I'm on the boards or advisory boards of 3 theatre and opera companies in Boston since I came back to Boston a year and a half ago.
This is your
theatre
passion.
and opera are also passions of mine.
And did you meet anyone interesting?
Oh, in theatre, I've met many quite famous actors, particularly in the UK, British actors. So yes, I've met quite a lot of them.
Interesting.
And so one name that people might recognize is Patrick Stewart, you know, of Star Trek fame. So I have a poster signed by him.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, the research part. Now, imagine you're stranded in a small village. You sought refuge in this small neighborhood pub that the locals are frequenting, and they are curious about who you are, what you do for a living, and they don't know your research. And how would you summarize your research to this audience? And when they ask you if your research is important, why is your research important? What would you say?
Well, it's always hard to explain, isn't it, in lay terms? But I would say I do research about how multinational companies, international companies, should manage their operations on an integrated basis around the world. This is important as the operations of multinational companies can no longer be managed on a standalone basis, country by country, because there's so many interconnections, such as global supply chains. Just think about how an automobile is assembled from components that come from all over the world.
What do you say to people who give you a pushback on and who favor nationalism and isolationist policies that are struggling with income inequality or wealth inequality? What is the response to a pushback like that?
I duck that a bit because I say that is the responsibility of economists, political scientists, and government people. So as a business academic, I focus on what multinational companies should do to do the best job that they can. And it's clear, of course, over the last 20 years that governments have not caught up with this and have not responded very well in dealing with income inequalities and the effects of global strategies of multinational companies, you know, in a world where labor is not easily mobile and people get trapped in small towns in the Midwest and so on. But I really do sort of claim the defense that that is not my specialty. That was the responsibility of the economists who really got it wrong. Economists thought that if we have globalization of companies, then the income aspects would be sorted out. So they always say on average, per capita incomes may grow, but they weren't very good at dealing with the inequalities and the redistribution of income towards the top and away from the bottom.
Interesting. I mean, over time, you've seen a lot of theories covered, a lot of contexts, geographies covered, but you must have observed there are certain things that are omitted in IB research. So what are the major omitted variables in IB research?
Actually, for me, it's not particular variables, but the omission of either one of two classes of variables. Most IB and other management research studies study either strategy content variables or strategy process variables. You really cannot do that separately as they interact. I know it's very hard to combine the two. And the one time I did it in a paper, we actually won a Best Theoretical Contribution Award in the Journal of International Marketing, which shows how hard it is to combine content and process. And it's also because researchers tend to be interested in either strategy content or strategy process, or IB content or IB process. So for me, that's the omitted variable problem.
I see. Well, given this, what do you see the next big question in IB or the next 5 to 10 years of our agenda in the field? What is the next thing coming?
Actually, I think it's Chinese management. Do you remember that in the 1980s, we had Japanese management and people were very interested in how Japanese management was different? Well, I think we're on the edge of people trying to understand what is different about Chinese management. You know, since China's about to become the largest economy in the world, we should really pay more attention to how the Chinese manage.
I see. And what aspects of Chinese management is different from what we are already talking about? Is it the government aspect? Is it the way that innovation is happening? Is it the way that they are thinking about firms? Which aspect is most salient for you?
Well, the first one, of course, you mentioned it, the government, which is that usually when governments intervene, it messes up the success of the economy, mostly. The Chinese seem to have found a way to have both government intervention and successful competition among companies. So that is an interesting dynamic between the two of them. I think the nearest in the West we've had is France. So France is actually the most like China of sort of semi-managed capitalism. So China's got this semi-managed capitalism. Then within companies, of course, They're more boss-oriented, they're less process-oriented, they make decisions faster. Now, of course, all this is perhaps in the context of a faster growing economy, but I think that Western management has become over formal and too process oriented.
In your opinion, what's the perspective? How will the perspective of the American policymakers shift towards the Chinese in the next 5 years?
Well, we've just had we're about to have a change of government. And so the Trump government decided to stand up to China, but not in very effective ways. So I think the Biden government will continue that, but in a more sensible way and in a more strategic approach. But certainly China won't have as easy as it has had for the last 20 years.
Well, let's switch gears a little bit and let's see how you formalize your thinking. I'm curious about how you think. So what does your mind think of when it wanders freely in a state of what we call idle curiosity?
Oh, well, I love history, and I'm also a bit of a fantasist. So I love thinking about the what ifs of history. So for example, what if the Spanish Armada had conquered England in 1588? And when I speculate on that, I think there might have been no British Empire, and then therefore no United States of America. And we'd either be speaking Spanish as part of a greater Mexico, or we'd be speaking, at least where I'm sitting in Maine, we'd be speaking French as part of a greater Quebec. So that's the kind of thing I fantasize about.
What if scenarios? I would like to follow up on this thing. How come, or why don't we? Why don't we do this type of a research in IB? Because I've taken a course in psychology, and this Berkeley psychologist was co-teaching it with an econ professor at Ohio State. They've got a terminology for this type of research, and it's very well established in psychology. What ifs, the scenario-based thinking. Why don't we do this thing in IB?
Well, it doesn't seem to be academically very rigorous. But now you ask me, I realize that to some extent, most of my research is at the what if stage, because I like to do research at what I call the frontiers of practice. So things like global strategy, global account management, Chinese innovation, and they are sort of what if. What if companies did adopt these frontier practices? So actually that ties together with my personal and private interests. Whereas most academic research tends to look to the past, doesn't it? How can we explain what has happened in the past? Whereas what if is, at least in a business research context, it's more about the future. What if American companies adopted Chinese management?
Because when you mentioned it, what I was thinking is, say, a British company enters France. And what if it had not entered France, but it had entered Russia, right?
Yeah.
We basically look at it from a different perspective. We don't look at the scenario, but we don't really visit the opportunities that are foregone or things that are not visited. It's like the sample selection issues and indigeneity issues, right?
Yeah.
And again, from your window, you've seen this shift in culture. IB scholars' culture has evolved over time, and the old school IB people had a different way of thinking, and the new school IB is quite different. In this evolution, what did we lose and what did we gain?
Well, for me, the evolution has clearly moved away from explaining international business context to explaining theory, and I think it's gone too far. So we've lost a lot in that. In fact, sometimes when I've reviewed papers, the authors actually try to hide the context. Like only halfway into the paper, do you realize that the data, for example, came from China? They actually try to hide that. So that's quite sad, I think, actually.
Why do they do that?
Well, because of the emphasis on theory now, that And also because, you know, that is a bit of a joke, but American data is universal and non-American data is particularist. So if your data is not American, you hide the fact that it's not American. And, you know, as IB scholars, we should certainly not be victims to this American-centric view of data.
Interesting. Which IB questions are overly studied and what areas are less fruitful?
Well, my bête noire, I'm sorry to say, is transaction costs. So I'll upset the transaction cost scholars, but I just don't see that's contributed very much. And the real test of that is, has there ever been an article in Harvard Business Review that that talks about transaction costs? It can't.
Has it been?
No. If it can't cross over to something that's useful for managers, then I think that's a bit of an academic cul-de-sac.
What's the biggest thing that the managers are interested in at the moment? What's the hottest topic for?
Well, there's no one answer to that, because in fact, I'll use the two words that I say are the two most important in an MBA program. It depends. It depends on the situation of the company. Now, more generally, it's strategic transformation, which I also do research on. So companies are always in a state of strategic transformation, triggered by changes in their environment. Right now, for companies, that, you know, the changes that in the very short term, COVID, but in the more ongoing term, are the triggers, are the changes caused by the internet, by digitization, and by artificial intelligence. So, you know, that's a big, particularly artificial intelligence. Companies are really wondering, how can we strategically transform ourselves to deal with artificial intelligence?
Well, I was talking to David Teese, and he says we don't do big data in international business research.
Sorry, can you say that again? What did David Teese say?
That we do not look into big data or in IB. Why is that?
Same thing, yeah. Well, yes, the two don't overlap that much. So we may be falling behind. I think the one IB aspect is that we could look at the international comparisons of how national cultures affect the adoption and use of big data and artificial intelligence. We certainly see that China is implementing artificial intelligence at a faster rate than the rest of the world because of their different views toward data privacy. That's an example of where it intersects with IB.
I mean, I would like to start talking about advice and the mentoring questions, but before I go through my list, I'm curious, what is your suggestion to new PhD students who are thinking about a dissertation in IB? Now that you've seen everything, you've written the books on these things, what is the next big dissertation topic?
I might duck that because I'm not a very good person for advising PhD students. I think you might ask some of the classically theory-oriented academics. I mean, the sad thing is, or you know, the reality is that a PhD student, you know, needs this sort of the combination of theory, context, and methods. They've got to find those three things to build a little area for themselves and a home. They need to have a home with a theoretical group. They need to have a home with a methodological group, and perhaps even a home with a context group. And that's actually my best advice for PhD students. And I've seen PhD students make the mistake of having very narrow PhD topics that are so narrow that, you know, they don't have much of a home, and it's not very expandable into follow-on projects.
Well, these were the questions that I would follow up with. For example, which skills are most difficult to develop, and what should they do, what should they not do? You basically answered those. Thank you. So
I think you missed a couple of questions that you'd sent to me by email. Actually.
Yep. Well, what do you wish you would have known when you were starting out in your career?
Sorry, what was the word?
What do you wish you'd known when you were starting out at the beginning?
That research is far more important than teaching. Certainly at the time I went into it in the late 70s, teaching seemed to be quite important, but it quickly turned out not to be. Now, I was at Harvard Business School, so that biased it a bit. So, and sadly, schools don't reward teaching much.
And what are the major mistakes that you see that IB scholars, IB PhD students make when they are practicing? What is the biggest issues that they get into?
You mean the PhD student? Well, I think
three things
what
that you need to avoid.
What I said about picking the wrong thesis topic. On the one hand, you need to go along with your thesis supervisor. On the other hand, you really need to create something that will lead to follow-on research for a number of years. I really want to talk about the question you didn't ask, which was what was your biggest failure and what did you learn from it?
Okay, let me ask you. What was your biggest failure?
So it turns out I was not much good working as a product manager inside Unilever, a large multinational company, which is ironic, given that my entire academic and consulting career has been about multinational companies. But then I was only 2 years out of university when I got that job. So it was really too early for me. But I have to say that I haven't, although I've worked quite a lot in business, it's been mainly in management consulting, and I don't really like being in operating companies because it's not intellectual enough for me. And then you had another related question, which is, what are you most proud of? Can I talk about that?
Sure, sure.
So career-wise, it's hard to pick one thing, but I'll pick two. So one is that being Dean of Rotterdam School of Management at Erasmus and successfully effecting the strategic transformation to make the school more connected to the world of business. It was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life and the most satisfying looking back. And the nice thing was that I got to apply what I teach in research. I got to apply strategy to the job of being a leader, of being a dean. So that was really satisfying. In terms of research, it is, of course, my book, Total Global Strategy. With that, I came out of nowhere, at least as far as IB was concerned, and established myself in IB by suddenly producing this book, which, and you know, as people say, overnight success. This one took me about 7 years from first getting the idea of working on global strategy for the book to actually come out.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm curious, I mean, from listening to you overall, you're integrating the business side of things and you're focusing on the context more. You're more applied. You would like to integrate the manager or put the manager back in the hot seat, right?
Yeah.
Is this the way to go, especially with the increased research activity from China or from the Asian countries? There's a lot of, in conferences, for example, there's a lot of Asian influence, Asian papers coming in. Is this the way that they think?
Well, I mean, I think it's the way to go to add value to the field. It's not necessarily the way to go to build an academic career, particularly when you're junior, because sadly, it's true that to get tenure for the first 7 years or so, you have to really focus on theory and not on context, and not particularly on managers either. But I do hope that once people get tenure and they become senior, they start paying more attention to this. And you know, I have a whole different talk about publishing in managerial journals and how it needs dual methodologies. You can't just convert it after the event. You know, one methodology, the classic academic one, is hypothesis testing, etc. But the other methodology is really talking to managers, getting close to them, and also operating at the frontier of practice, not just operating at the frontier of theory. So I guess my kind of parting wish is that I hope as people get more senior, they'll combine looking at the frontier of theory with the frontier of practice and getting closer to managers.
Interesting. Well, for the sake of time, what is the one last question that I should have asked you, but I didn't?
Well, I already did that. The two questions that the omitted questions. So I brought those
Omitted
back.
questions are different. Omitted questions
Yes.
are different. So omitted
Yes.
variables in IB. But what's one question that, for example, some people talk about their co-authors. Some people like to talk about their family. Something that I should have brought up in this interview. What is one question that I should have asked, but didn't because it wasn't the focal point?
Well, sticking with the career, it's really how did I manage my career? And because I went back and forth between academia and practice, and I have to say it was actually very difficult because I'm a bit of a misfit, really. So I don't fully fit in academia. I don't fully fit in practice. So, so again, answering that question, I wouldn't advise other younger people to follow the path that I took. It was actually a pretty high risk, difficult path, and I was very lucky that it mostly worked out.
Interesting. Well, George, thank you so much for your time and for this interesting and candid interview. I learned a lot, and I'm sure other people did too. Thank you.
Thank you, Agaz. Thank you very much. Enjoyed it.